Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to see you, and it's been a pleasure to get to know you during the past week. Although, ironically, I'm recording this before the class begins, so I haven't gotten to know you yet. And that's a little bit relevant to this presentation because I obviously won't be able to build in some of the anecdotes that you've told, some of the experiences you've reported, and some of the challenges you've had. But we will be discussing this session in class, so we'll be able to use some of those examples when we review this later on. But let me tell you about what this session is about and why we're setting aside a special introductory recording of it to introduce you to it. This is about exit strategies. Exit strategies assumes that at some point our funding is going to stop. And the question is, what do we want to see happen at that time? So a little bit of a backdrop. As you certainly know by now, I've been teaching courses like this since before the year 2000. But it wasn't until 2008 that the whole issue of exit strategies came up. Why? Because in 2008, there was the Great Recession. And all of a sudden, clients, students, people in the philanthropy field in general saying, oh my goodness, we don't have as much money. What do we do? What are the ethical things to do? What are the correct things to do? What are the responsible things to do? And so it didn't take long for me and for others to realize that we needed to focus on that. And I began to do some presentations and workshops specifically about what to do when you have to stop funding. And when you and in a few minutes, when we look at the contents of this, you're going to see there's an entire section of this presentation which deals with the question of what do we do when a situation calls for us to discontinue our funding. However, after a while, people challenge that and say, well, wait a second. We're not discontinuing funding only when there's a crisis, only when we have to cut things back. There's an exit strategy that applies for all of our grant making. And so I began to refocus this entire presentation over the years to talk about all the variables that we take into consideration when we make a grant, when we consider renewables, what we expect out of a grant, and then what are the circumstances when we might have to discontinue before a grant is over. This particular session also is a little bit distinctive in the course of our course. Why do I say that? Well, you've been here for a week. You know that this is not a course which is built around how to do things. It is primarily around how to think about things, how to make good decisions. However, there are a few segments of this curriculum which have much more specificity about how we make decisions. This is one of them. And one of the things that we've learned over time, and I've learned over time, is that focusing on exit strategies is one of the most useful ways of funders thinking about good grant making, thinking about the ways in which they are going to be satisfied and gratified with their grant, and at the same time anticipate what should happen as a result of the grant. So what we're going to do now in this session, and before we do it together, is go through some segments of this unit, the details of which are going to be available for you after I finish talking or independent of that. And more to the point, after we talk about it in the class, fill in some of the gaps that are there purposely. We're going to redo this, we're going to re-edit this, and then you'll have access to a much more a complete version of this presentation for your own practical use subsequently. So with that introduction, let's begin to look at the PowerPoint that's going to accompany me. And you see exit strategies when the bucks stop here. That's exactly what this is about. And if we go to the 2 pages later, we're going to see the contents of this. And I want a few words on the content. You'll see I made reference earlier to the discontinuing funding situations, pages 14 to 18. You notice that even before we get to pages 14 to 18, there are all sorts of situations that can inform our exit strategy thinking. And what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the various circumstances and what are the conditions or circumstances or situations to think about or anticipate when we make a grant in each of these situations. We're not going to discuss each of these in depth in this presentation, but I am going to focus on a few of them that will be helpful so that as you look at it subsequently, independent of me, you're going to be able to see what the approach is in these in this unit. So let's look at the next page. Why an exit strategy? All right. Well, every grant has an end, even if that end is renewal. In other words, the fact is that even, and we're going to talk about that in a second, even if your whole approach is to do multi-year unrestricted grant making, multi-year still means that there's going to be some time when you have to rethink it. What do you want to know about that? What are the ground rules related to that multi-year unrestricted grant? But even in that situation, grants are supposed to accomplish something. What is it supposed to accomplish? Interestingly, for whom? One of the things we're going to see is that sometimes there's an interest of the funder, and sometimes there's an interest of the grantee, and hopefully there's an alliance, there's an alignment between what those two are about. More to the point, and I think we've already seen this during this week, and it will come up again during the remainder of the class, one of the things we recognize is that as funders, there are different kinds of relationships that we have with grantees. In some cases, we give money because it's almost like it's our tax. We're going to give money to our alma mater, and we're not giving so much that a building is going to be named after us, or a program or a lectureship is going to be named after us. But nevertheless, we care about our alma mater and we want to give some money to it. That's one kind of relationship. Another kind of relationship is we are specifically seeing the grantee as a partner in implementing something that we both care about. And our funding is crucial to that project. It's crucial to the ability of the grantee to implement that project. And so that there's a very different kind of relationship we have when we make a grant in that circumstance. And what are the ground rules related to it? What do we expect out of it? What's going to happen at the end of the process? And finally, especially when we talk about the end of discontinuing grant making, circumstances evolve. What happened in 2008? I made a quick reference to it. Well, most of you know that was the time of the Great Recession. Funders by the year 2009 had substantially less money at their disposal than they had at the beginning of 2008. They had made commitments for 2008, but they had a lot less money for 2009. That's a circumstance which was independent of the relationship. We're going to see when we get to the discontinuing funding that there's other circumstances which may inform our decision to discontinue funding that are independent of such macro issues, such larger events such as the Great Recession. But they're there, and we have to talk about what are the ethical and responsible ways to think about our behavior when we decide that we have to discontinue our funding. So let's now look at when do we develop an exit strategy? Well, interestingly enough, even though exit strategy means the end, the best time, and this is good practice, and this is one of the kinds of things that I wish that I had been smart enough to start teaching and influencing, frankly, myself when I was heading a foundation. Ideally, one wants to think about these things at the time of every grant decision. And the reason for that is I learned over time, when I would talk to funders who would talk to me as either a client or took courses, one of the things I discovered was that rarely were people sorry that they made a grant. What they were sorry about is that they didn't define what their expectations were at the time they made the grant. What was going to make them satisfied? What was going to make them make us glad that or feel that we did the right thing? It wasn't a matter of success or failure of the project. It was a matter of what did we really want to have out of it. Sometimes they were were things that were not substantive, but they were emotionally important. What kind of recognition should there be if there was a major gift given? Does one want to be involved in thinking about it as a partner in the process? Is there going to be something that's published? And we're going to talk about some of these deliverables in a few moments. But there's also situations when no matter how much you think about it ahead of time, and we plan ahead of time, circumstances change. Something changes with a grantee so that they can't deliver the project. Something happens with our funding, our policies change, and we want to make some changes. So there are circumstances that even if at the time of the grant decision we've thought everything through, some things come along that are unanticipated. It's just the nature of life, the nature of the world. And frankly, as we have said before, and we will say before the end of this class, let's remember that when we do grant making, we're funding the future. The future is never certain. We can limit the risks, we can limit the variables, but at the end of the day, we can control only so much. And one of the kinds of things we sometimes have to do is to make adjustments, even if we never anticipated that those circumstances would be there. It's always important. As I say, hopefully we've said it earlier in the class, and I guarantee that before we finish this class, we will repeat it again. So now let's go on to the next page. And let's talk about what should be the simplest. The simplest is we have a relationship. Perhaps it's a trusting relationship. Perhaps we're willing to give, as is currently very popular, multi-year unrestricted grant making. But nevertheless, we may have expectations, even if it turns out that they're not very specific. They're not project related. But the question is, if we're giving multi-year unrestricted grants, even in those circumstances, it means that we have some relationship with the grantee. There's something that has given us the trust in that grantee. There's something that says multi-year doesn't mean forever. It may mean that it's 3 years renewable. It may mean 5 years renewable. So the question we have to ask ourselves when we make that grant is, do we have conditions for that? Do we want to say that we're going to give the same amount when we renew things? Are we willing to increase it looking into the future? Or as some funders do, they give a grant for a certain number of years and their policy is that they decrease it over time. There may be many reasons for this, and we can talk about, if you wish, why sometimes those circumstances apply one way or another. But invariably, what's most crucial here is if you're going to give even an unrestricted multi-year grant, that we make it clear to the grantee what that means and what the circumstances would be for there to be renewal. Or are there circumstances which would mean that even though it's a multi-year unrestricted grant, they're not going to be eligible for renewal for whatever reason? It may be our internal policies. The degree to which we're clear for ourselves and we clarify that for the grantee is good grant-making practice. Thinking about that at the beginning is something that allows us to be responsible grant makers and allows the grantee to plan appropriately. Okay, next. Now, the next section, which we're going to go through, has to do with if we're going to make grants, and actually we have expectations, there are deliverables. And I'm going to go through various circumstances of the deliverables. The one that we're not going to discuss in depth is about evaluation. What if one of the things you want to do is an evaluation? And the reason for that simply is that there's a whole unit on evaluation as part of this course. We can summarize that when we discuss it later on, but there's no reason to spend the time now doing that. However, the next deliverable is publication dissemination. It is not uncommon for funders to have a field of interest or a focus of interest. We care very much about everything that's happening in our geographic area. We care very much about early childhood education. We care very much about about fighting hunger or food insecurity. And so one of the things that we do sometimes is we say, well, gee whiz, our field of interest is in this entire area. We're funding lots of organizations in this area, but what we may want to do is to publish some sort of summative report of what's happened with all of our with all of our grantees. One of the things that's about, if that's something that you want to do, whether you're going to publish it yourself or you're going to contract for publication, it's really crucial to let grantees know that you're going to do that for all sorts of reasons. The simplest and the most direct is that, in fact, you're going to want them to keep certain kind of information in the same way that everybody else is keeping the information, so that if you're going to publish some comparative studies or some reporting, that you're in fact able to publish similar information. It's not the same as an evaluation. It's a matter of keeping track of it. And so to tell people that that's one of the expectations that are going to be there is something that we need to make clear at the very beginning. What is the context of that dissemination and publication that we expect will happen? Who's going to do it? And what kind of information is going to be most useful? It may be very different kind of data than we would do for an evaluation, very different kind of data that we would do for some other kind of reports, but nevertheless, we want to keep track of it. Now, I want to look at the caution at the bottom of this page. The caution is that when we do grant making, we don't own the intellectual property of what the grantee does. In other words, we don't automatically have access to their own material, to their own findings, their own research. We don't own it. We are giving money to somebody to do something on their own. Okay, they're not doing it for us. We can discuss with them what our expectations are. As we're going to talk about many times in this course, they will have a right to say no. But it's important to recognize that the standard is that the intellectual property of material provided to grantees is owned by the grantee, and the permission to use it and the permission to publish it and the permission to have it is something needs to be clarified with the grantee up front. There are most grantees are willing to do that, but it's important to remember who owns it. And there are circumstances where some grantees are willing to share that intellectual property. Universities, with rare exceptions, are not willing to share that intellectual property. And other organizations which have a lot of discretionary or confidential material will also go to the line and say, we will not share some of this information. It's important, if you are going to want to do a publication or dissemination of information afterwards, this is an area where foundations and funders trip themselves up because they don't understand what the formal legal relationship is with the grantee up front and get clarification on this. I've seen too many situations where tension arises at the end because this was never discussed at the beginning. Okay, next. Longevity. Another area that once we say this, it's very obvious. You give money to a project, and you're willing to be the major funder of the project, and then one of the things that you have is an expectation that after your money is spent, whether it's for 5 years or 3 years or 6 years, that you want this to have a longevity within the organization. If that's the case, that's not something that you can spring upon the grantee in year 5 of the 6-year funding. It's something you have to discuss up front for all sorts of reasons. Number one, because there may be different ways in which your funding can be most useful to develop long-term funding. A grantee may say, give us this money as a challenge grant so we can find other funders. Or conversely, they may say, give us a small amount of money during the startup stage and a larger amount of money later on so we can implement it and begin to bring other people in. Or they, and the conditions to be able to have a longevity continuity of a program should be understood right from the beginning, so the grantee knows that's your expectation, knows what long-term role you want to play, and is able to plan with us how the funding that we're giving is best used. an example that I'm not going to go into great detail, but a funding partnership of which I happened to be chair of, 12 foundations ultimately made a decision to spin off this project. And one of the things that was done to 2 universities, and the condition with the 2 universities was that there would be 3 years of transition funding, conditional on the 2 universities finding independent funding to guarantee that the program existed for at least 3 years after that. It's an interesting story. If we can, when we're together, if you want me to push that story, because there's interesting learnings that came with that. But the conditions were very clear. They knew that there was some additional startup funding. There were 3 years of transition funding and 3 years of a minimum 3 years of expectation afterwards. There was the longevity was built into the relationship with the grantees. Right, next. Capacity building. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think we will be covering this in another session of the course. But bear in mind that sometimes we as funders will say, look, we have a limit to what we're going to give money for, but we really care about the health of our grantees. And so one of the things that we provide is consultants. We provide some training. We provide some convenings. We provide some advocacy so that we can help both the field and our particular grantees enhance their ability to do the work that they do independent of us being grant makers. It's a way in which many funders nowadays it's a role that many funders are using effectively, and it's something to think about, because we often can bring resources to bear that are beyond the ability of small to medium-sized organizations. And for us to provide that funding, that expertise, that training, the capacity building can be extraordinarily useful to the health of an organization long after our cash runs out. Next. This is an area of replication application. A couple of words about it. I don't know if any of us, I probably should know by now, but since I'm recording this before we know each other, it's not uncommon for funders to say, we're going to put money to a project and it's going to be replicable around the country. We're not going to fund the replication, but we want this to be a model program. Now, here's the dilemma with that. Well, first of all, it's great. It's a great idea. And sometimes it's a wonderful role for a funder to play, to take the risk capital on the table, to be able to say, we're going to show that something good can happen with it. Here's the dilemma. The dilemma is that very often funders are willing to fund a startup model program, but forget that for it to really be a model program, there needs to be documentation that accompanies that. So that if some other place you fund something in Philadelphia, and someone in this course is in California, and they say, "Oh, I love that program," and they look at the flyers, they look at the reports, but they haven't really seen how they got from A to B to C to D. One of the things we recommend is that if you want to fund a model program, that along with that, you make sure that you're funding somebody to do the appropriate documentation so that somebody else who wants to apply this, to replicate this program, is going to be able to know what questions were answered, what variables had to be addressed, so that it can be applied in a different setting as effectively. And one other little tidbit on this. Very often, the most creative people who are able to develop model programs are not necessarily great at documenting them. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of instinct that comes with creative types, and not necessarily the self-reflection that's necessary to do the documentation. You may want to fund somebody or a program or an organization because they're known for their creativity, but we as funders may want to step aside and say we need to fund somebody to work alongside of them so that their creativity can go at full speed, and we can keep track of it so we know what's actually been answered in the process. Next. Okay. Now, what we're not going to talk about here tonight in this recording are the next two situations, because I want to spend some time together in the course talking about them, because they are special situations, and I want to spend a little bit more time on them in a more interactive way. The first is endowments, which can be very loaded and have all sorts of tricky elements to them. And the second one, the next page, is capital giving, or giving a building. Both of those have particular challenges of exit strategies. And even though on the surface, it sounds like, okay, you give a big amount of money and you're finished with it, ironically, people trip over themselves because of the questions that are not properly answered, that come back to haunt them later on. We're going to spend some time talking about them in the class. And now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about discontinuing the funding. And once again, you're going to have access to this. We're going into detail about the various circumstances when we discontinue the funding, but I want to talk about some of the practice and the ethical issues related to it. Now, so let's talk about situation number one. This is the easiest. We make decisions as a funder that we have different priorities. We make decisions. We discovered that the Great Recession has really impacted our ability to give things, and we discovered that places where we have been perfectly comfortable to give money because we care about them, but they're not essential to us, or they're no longer our priorities, or we don't think that they are part of our future. Moreover, even though we may have been funding this organization or even this project for for a number of years, frankly, our money is not essential to it. To take an example that I said earlier in the presentation, you make an annual gift to your alma mater. The likelihood is that unless you're one of a very few people, the amount of money that you and I are giving to our alma mater is not make or break money to our alma mater to be able to open the doors. Obviously, our alma mater wants us to continue to give, but if we discontinue funding, it's not going to, in most cases, I suspect, it's not going to cause a great impact on the university to continue to do its work. And even with smaller organizations, we can be very minor funding in a project. The grantee may be happy that we're funding it, but if we withdraw our funding, it's not going to impact it radically. So we can, at that point, so because it's not essential, we have no ethical obligation to continue funding once we've decided not to do so. We have a responsibility, if they know who we are, to tell them why, and to explain it, that. But essentially, if it turns out at the next grant cycle, or the next time we send money, we don't include them, we have not violated any ethical obligation. Now, bear in mind, if we've made a multi-year commitment to them, we have to pay out that obligation. We don't discontinue in the middle of it, but once that's over, we can simply say no more funding. However, situation B. Here's where we begin to get some interesting situations. Bear in mind, we've said it earlier in the class, I'm sure. We will say it, I promise you, we will say it before the class is over. Not everything that we fund is successful. I said it earlier in this presentation. We're always funding the future. We cannot anticipate everything. We didn't anticipate COVID. We didn't anticipate the Great Recession. There are things that have an impact on our grantees that are beyond their control. And as much as they may have tried to accomplish a project, they may not have been able to do so. That failure is not terrible. It's not an indictment of them. And even if it turns out that there's not major cataclysmic events such as the two I talked about, but there's circumstances that came up that they couldn't anticipate. Their major staff person decided to leave in the middle, or something like that. But they did nothing wrong. They absolutely, the project didn't succeed, but not because they didn't do everything they said they were going to do. In that situation, if it turns out that it makes sense jointly with that grantee to discontinue the project, by all means, you can stop funding up what you funded up to that point, except for one element. If the grantee, in good faith, has rented a space, hired staff, made other commitments based on our funding, then we should consider it an obligation to continue that part of our funding because they've incurred that debt based on that goodwill. We don't punish failure, well-intended failure. There are situations where we might decide to punish, as we'll come to later on, but failure with every intention to try to do the right thing is not something we punish. And it's an important thing for us as funders to recognize. If we're really serious about being good, responsible, ethical funders, we have to recognize that some percentage of what we do is just not going to succeed, and there's no reason to be punitive about it. However, moving ahead, sometimes, however, rarely, but it sometimes happens, and I have to say that if we want, I can give examples when we're together in the class. There are times when an organization has manipulated the facts or manipulated the funding in such a way that that they haven't accomplished what we thought they were funding. And here it happens in two cases. I'm going to talk about the two. And bullet point one is they did it willfully. They just manipulated. It doesn't happen often, but occasionally we have a situation where an organization just simply says, I don't care what the funder says. I'm sure I can fake it with them. We're going to spend the money how we want, even though they gave it to us for another purpose. Look, there are times, and in those situations, we can be stronger. We can, assuming we've thought all the things through and we feel it's the right thing to do, you can stop funding right away because they have failed to do their part of the contract, the implicit contract. Sometimes, however, there's a situation where the grantee has actually failed to live up to what they claimed to want to do, but it wasn't because they were willful about it. It's just because they interpreted their initial interpretation of what to do seemed to be off base. Just a very quick example without going into detail. I was part of a funding collaborative which funded a program in prestigious prep schools. It was supposed to be a curriculum on ethics, but the person who was the primary educator who was implementing this had a particular teaching methodology. It turned out when we had an outside evaluator review the first several years of the program, every one of the prep schools loved the teaching methodology, and not one of them had implemented the ethics program. Turned out that it was by no means proven that the ethics program was a flawed program. What was proven was that the educator had a different agenda than the funders did. It turned out we went back to the drawing board, brought a different educator in, and that's a program that existed and expanded quite substantially, and it existed for about 20 years after that. So here's a case where the program failed to do what it initially was claiming, not because it was trying to cheat, but just because it was the wrong person and had the wrong idea. So there can still be great ideas that just haven't reached their potential. This is where sensitive thinking on the part of a funder is to understand what really went wrong there. Was it because the organization tried to manipulate, or because the organization just missed the boat? All right, let's talk about the next situation. Now, what about the situation which I made a couple of references? Let's say the Great Recession, totally unrelated to the grantee. You decide to discontinue funding. There's a new leadership of the foundation. There's new professional staff that has urged a different priority setting. The pandemic hits, and it turns out that there was a sense that there was some overwhelming needs that take priority over what's been funded for a long time. There were inappropriate bets in the stock market, all sorts of reasons that totally unrelated to the grantee. There's a decision to discontinue funding. And here's the unlike situation A, which we talked about, the organization is fully or substantially dependent on what we give. In other words, it's not as if our money is incidental to the organization or to the project. They've been depending on it. And in fact, they may have created the program exclusively dependent on our funding. They haven't done anything wrong. They've done everything we've asked them to do, and they've done it well. And we funded this project for a period of time. Then, go to the next page. Then this is where ethical discontinuation really matters. And this is a situation that came up in 2008. It came up around COVID, and invariably it will come up in other circumstances that we can't anticipate, or even in your own funding situation. First thing you have to do is advise the grantee as early as possible that a change is going to take place. Then this is the most essential. Even if there is no legal obligation to fund beyond our current commitments, the ethical and responsible thing to do is to phase out the grant making over time, even though we may have decided to discontinue that grant making into the future. And that's a crucial thing to do. In other words, it's not their fault. We want to help them figure out how to get beyond the funding on which they had depended and had no reason to believe that there was a dissatisfaction. There are some times where people have phased it out by giving a challenge grant or a matching grant, or in some few cases, an endowment grant as a way of tiding things over. A classic case I'd like to point out, which is already 2 or 3 generations ago in the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation for a long time was known for founding its own organizations. $1 every year was $1 of those organizations came from the Ford Foundation. New leadership came into the Ford Foundation, new board came into the Ford Foundation. They said, we don't want to do things that way anymore. Here you had these organizations that were created by the Ford Foundation, let alone dependent on it. So the Ford Foundation had dealt with it by having a multi-year phase out and gave every one of those organizations some sort of endowment grant. Now, not every one of us is a Ford Foundation. Not every situation is quite as radical and as extreme as the Ford Foundation. But what it suggests is that while there are legal, we may not have legal responsibility to be a responsible and ethical grant maker if there is that dependence, and there's no reason that the grantee has been at fault or questioned, or the quality of the program is under question. We do have ethical responsibilities to make sure that we phase out our funding in a responsible, collaborative way. Okay, next. Now, this is if there's a takeaway of all of this, the ground rules. We're going to come back to this when we're together, and it really reinforces some ideas that we've already talked about and we'll talk about during the rest of the week. Grantees only know what our expectations are if we tell them. In other words, that don't put a grantee in a situation of wondering if you're going to do a site visit, or you're going to want a quarterly report, or you're going to want to publish something at the end, or you're going to want to have an evaluator evaluate the effectiveness of the program. If we have expectations, they're only going to know what they are if we tell them. It's not a guessing game. Moreover, it's our responsibility to define that relationship, but, and this is crucial for responsible grant making, potential grantees should feel free to suggest refinements to any grant, and even reject a grant if it overreaches. That can be a good, healthy thing. And the reason for that is because why should we fund mediocrity? Why should we fund mediocrity? If it turns out that realistically a grantee needs $100,000 to do a project, and we say, well, we're going to discount it because we like to discount everybody's grant, and we offer only $50,000. Basically, what we're saying to them is we just don't want to give you that much. And the grantee says, okay, but that means we're going to do something that we can't accomplish it for that much. We should have enough trusting relationship with grantees to know what if that's true, and to be able to assess that. We may decide on circumstances to say we've offered too little, or we may come up with some alternative as to what is legitimate deliverable for that amount of money. But we want to make it safe, and we've talked about this before in the course, and we'll come back to it. We want to make it safe for a grantee to say no to us in a responsible way, because ultimately they're the ones that have to implement it. It reflects badly on us if they can only implement it in a way that brings mediocrity or failure. And we therefore want to have that as an open relationship. So we want them to feel free to in that relationship to say what's necessary to do the job. Moreover, there's sometimes we overreach. There are times when we will make a grant. We talked about this during the ethics cases, where in fact it requires a grantee to radically change itself. And that's an overreach. It means that we're implementing, that we're not only participating in the key decision making of that organization, but we're mandating that it changes its very nature. That and to be challenged on that and to be called on that can be a very good thing, because it forces us to be more responsible in our grant making, and it reinforces the fact that we have a trusting relationship. And finally, the earlier we as funders establish those expectations, the more likely the grant will prove gratifying to both sides. And ultimately, if we're going to give money, that's what we want. We want it to be successful, not simply because it accomplishes the measurables, the metrics that we may come to as our expectations, but we also want to make sure that the character of that relationship, the style of that relationship is consistent with what's going to make us feel as if we have both the funder and the grantee. We as the funder and as the grantee have a relationship which essentially makes us all both feel good and look good. So that's a summary of this project of the exit strategies. You're going to have this after we discuss some of these things in class in more detail, and we're going to fill in the gaps of places where we didn't talk about it at all. We're going to put this on the site. You're going to have access to it, and I think you're going to find that during the course of this class, as I said at the very beginning, this is one of the 2 or 3 cases where we're giving you a how-to that you're going to refer to with some regularity, because it becomes so useful as a way of focusing our grant making in a very productive way from the get-go. So thanks very much. Thanks for watching. Look forward to seeing you soon again in class, and look forward to your feedback.